you everybody for coming, dear students, dear colleagues. It is a great pleasure both for Kyiv Mohyla Academy and for all of us to have His Excellency Matty Maasікас, who is the head of the representation of the European Union to Ukraine. I'm really glad that we could organize this event. And before we start, I have to say a lot of flattering words, maybe to you and also to your teams and to your colleagues. Thank you very much to the European Union mission to Kyiv. They were very good and still are very good in organizing, contacting, and doing all this thing. And we at Kyiv Mohyla community, those of us who are in Kyiv, in Ukraine, are really flattered and glad to have this opportunity. So, Your Excellency, thank you very much for coming. Before we start, just some couple of things on how we're going to proceed. His Excellency informed me that he will be very short in introducing a couple of key points, like 15 minutes or something. Then we sent in advance questions that you asked. Some of them were rather provocative. As the moderator, I have to admit that I did not delete a single question. I just grouped them into blocks of questions. And afterwards, maybe we'll have some sort of discussion, if it all can be fitted into 1 hour of our meeting, okay? So I would hate to steal any time of our discussion, so Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Excellent. I'm very honored, very proud by this invitation to speak to you, to one of the finest universities in this country, with long traditions, and now also having had to reorganize many things, how you operate and continue working під час повномасштабної. I think it's no coincidence either that we are here in the basement. I looked at the questions that you had pre-sent to me, and do not hesitate to ask more in the course. I have until 3 o'clock exactly, so we should have ample time for further questions as well. But first on, which was also the underlying tone of most of your questions. Where do we stand right now, Ukraine and the EU? And I will not list all the assistance, all the help that the EU is giving now, has given since February last year. But I will focus on the most important, and that is politically, and that is the enlargement track. 23rd of February last year, there were not many people in the EU, in Brussels or in national capitals, who would have been ready to discuss opening enlargement perspective to Ukraine, and in fact to any other country that didn't have it before. There are several reasons for that. Enlargement, in fact, for the existing members of the club, has never been a universally popular policy. Because enlargement, opening your doors, means opening your doors, your purses to others. The club itself is already pretty, feels pretty well. The club members know each other well. Why should we let in some newcomers? In the 1960s, the French president de Gaulle twice vetoed the British wish to join the EU. In the 1980s, when southern European countries acceded there were huge, not hesitations, but there were huge uncertainties, fears. Now these agricultural countries become members. What will happen to our agricultural subsidies? What will happen to our money? When maybe historically the most, or politically the most smoothest wave of enlargement was the fifth enlargement in 1990s and early 2000, because it was the era when the Berlin Wall had gone down and there was this feeling that winds of history are in our sails. We are reuniting the continent and everything. And that's, we call it the fifth enlargement in the EU slang. And that's a wave of enlargement that I experienced already myself, as well as a young Estonian civil servant, then on the receiving end of this. And then later on I represented Estonia in the EU in Brussels, and then switched to represent the EU now to work for the EU institutions. But even then, there were questions and hesitations. Never earlier had so many countries acceded at once. Never earlier had so much poorer countries acceded the EU at once, with obvious consequences for the Union's budget, but also a more fundamental question whether big and expensive EU policies like common agricultural policy or cohesion policy, meaning regional policy, whether these policies can be sustainable if so many and so poor countries are acceding, etc. So precautionary steps were taken, like for the first time in Union's history, member states were allowed to have a transition, to impose a transition period on free movement of people, free movement of labor. Finland, where I at that time served as Estonia's ambassador, Finland had been very, very sympathetic towards Estonia's accession. Of course, it's clearly in any country's interest if your neighboring country becomes so much more secure and so much more stable and prosperous with this membership. But then when it was sealed, then the Finnish government, due to domestic tensions, the Finnish government also imposed this transition period for workers, for them mainly Estonian workers. They had to give it up after 2 years because it did not make sense. But this is to illustrate to you that if things in the enlargement process seem slow and cumbersome to you, and if the EU, if Brussels seems to you unfriendly, there's an awful lot of reasons for that that have nothing to do with Ukraine. Has nothing to do with the question, do you want us or not? Do you actually want us? Of course we do. Of course we do, and this was one of the questions to start with was, like, what can Ukraine bring to the EU? Ukraine has redynamized the EU in several senses already. Russia's war against Ukraine brought full-scale war back to Europe, and the European Union has risen to the occasion. The European Union has had to change several things, several working patterns, methods that formerly were not there, like giving lethal weapons from the EU, actually from the EU funds, the European Peace Facility, providing lethal weapons. The EU was always thought to be a peace project. Now the EU is helping to arm a neighboring country. The EU has had to start thinking geopolitically. And thinking geopolitically in this sense means choosing sides. It has always been so hard for the EU to choose sides. It's because the EU was more of an economic and trade entity, and then, of course, this obligation to uphold peace in Europe, it was always so strong. So as soon as a military conflict broke out anywhere, it was always the first instinct was to say, there is no military solution. All sides need to cease fire, and all sides need to do steps, and all sides need to come to the negotiating table. This is gone now. What Russia did and is doing is so grave. The breach of international law, the war crimes, the declared attempts to wipe the whole nation of Ukraine with its culture off the world map. It's so serious, it's so grave that the EU has started working quite in a different way. So if you ask what Ukraine can do for the EU, you are doing it already. You have re-energized or energized several things. You mostly study social studies, right? One may have heard also, in connection with the Ukraine's enlargement process, the voices within the EU that say, first, the EU needs to reform itself. That the EU cannot accept new members, especially new big members, before issues. Some things within the EU are being changed. What do they mean with that? It's mostly decision-making mechanisms. First, who has, because decision-making among the member states takes place according to a certain formula. Each member state has a certain number of votes. So this is one issue. And the second issue is with every enlargement, it has been the question, if we have so many members now, can we afford unanimous or unanimity rule? Because it's so hard to bring now 27. In the coming years, maybe 30 plus. It's so hard to bring so many countries to agree on one thing. And of course, if one says before taking new members, the EU must reform itself, it's also on some EU policies and financing of these EU policies. It's no secret to you, 60% or 2/3 of the EU budget still go to these two big policies, common agricultural policy and regional policy. And then, of course, Ukraine's size, strength of Ukraine's agricultural sector, and of course Ukraine's still low income, GDP levels, logically make people pose these questions. My advice to the Ukrainians, and especially the Ukrainian political leadership, has always been, don't you care about these discussions at all? That's for the existing members of the club. There were always, as I laid out earlier, there were always questions with each and every enlargement wave. And focus on the current homework that needs to be done in order to start accession negotiations, and then when you get closer to the EU, you'd be much better positioned to take part in these discussions. And also, you may see that not all those discussions are that serious or will bring so tangible results. The issue of unanimous voting as opposed to qualified majority voting within the EU is a particularly significant one. Almost all policies now, almost all decisions are being taken in the EU by qualified majority among member states. Only foreign policy, taxation policy, were the others where unanimity is needed. The long-term budget has to be, 7-year budget needs to be decided by unanimity. At the same time, in the intra-EU discussions, you always you try first to achieve consensus. You always want to bring all member states on board to address each and every individual member state's particular concerns before you go, okay, this is not reasonable, this we cannot do, this we cannot afford, okay, let's go for a majority vote. They always, because the EU is a club of very friendly members to each other. You always want to have everybody on board. Now, another issue that from time to time, and I end my introductory passage with that. Another issue that from time to time occurs is should neighboring countries really, do they have to become full members? With all voting rights, with all budget-related benefits and everything, can't there be another model or in-between model? In early 1990s, when the Nordic countries wanted to join, even a separate mechanism called the European Economic Area was created, and in fact, Norway and Iceland are still members of the European Economic Area, which means they implement all EU single market related legislation, and for that they are part of EU single market. But they are not members of the EU, they do not vote, they do not have, and they have to contribute to EU's budget. All countries in Central and Eastern Europe have always wanted to become full members. Because for us, apart from economic issues, the EU membership always meant security as well. And that makes all the sense. I have seen, I have felt it, I am feeling it in my country, Estonia. Belonging to the biggest single market in the world, using as a Eurozone member one of the leading currencies in the world that gives you security as well. Security is not only what you can buy with arms or achieve with arms or being well armed. So don't be fully surprised if down the road of Ukraine's accession process, Ukraine's hopefully also Moldova, Georgia. Somebody in Brussels or somewhere asks, well, but can't there be an in-between Model A hybrid model? Don't turn any attention to that. Go for a full membership. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. This is the best way to finish by a representative of the European Union to Ukraine, his speech by saying, opt for the full membership option. That is very good and very inspiring. I would just briefly say my takeaways. I really wrote it down, that thinking geopolitics is about taking sides. And of course, the European Union took side very clearly, and that was also among the questions that you received. Then you also spoke about interesting things for us, those who are working with political science and international relations, about how decision-making mechanisms within the European Union can be changed or can change. And if we can really afford unanimously rules of voting in the future, that's also interesting for maybe a political science discussion. And I also like that you mentioned once we go as far as to the accession negotiations, I'm sure we will be there at some point, what will happen then. So that was truly inspiring. So I suggest, because you saw the questions and you answered almost most of them, apart from a couple of rather provocative, I suggest we do some interaction with the audience and we can take a couple of questions from the audience. Okay?
Absolutely.
Colleagues, please, I think we can take, if you don't mind, a couple of questions at the same time, so as to be more energetic. So please raise hands, and I see there is a microphone for you, for those who would like to ask a question.
What do you see as the main problems on the path of Ukraine's accession to the EU? Maybe the government is underperforming in some aspect, or maybe anti-corruptional, judicial reforms, and so on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, but the question about Ukrainian problems is always a good question. So what are our problems then?
Thank you. Administration. I mean, if I think of the experiences of the enlargement waves in Central Eastern Europe and also, if I think of of Ukraine's situation at the moment, administration will be a big challenge. Ukraine is so big, you know better than me. And some things are easier to do in a small country. Some streamlining, some reforms, easier to do in smaller countries. This, I'm sure, can be overcome pretty, not easily, but with efforts. You have this unique situation where 90% of Ukrainians support EU membership, where all political parties, or main political parties, support EU membership. So that gives the confidence and strength to the government to pursue these reforms. And all successful EU integration processes in Central Eastern Europe have always been based on strong domestic consensus. So preserving that is very, very, very important. If one looks at, in order to become EU member state, you need to adopt and implement all EU legislation. That very much means for the functioning of the single market, the standards, rules and regulations. And the EU standards are very high. EU consumers are wealthy and very demanding. And there cannot be shortcuts there. Because the single market cannot function if in one part of the market not all rules, standards and regulations are being followed. Takes awful lot of regulatory work, but also takes awful lot of technical work to follow these standards. And again, a pretty universal experience from Central Eastern Europe is that environmental standards are very costly. Of course, and those wealthy, demanding EU citizens, they want to have the highest environmental standards in the world. And this, to implement them for countries whose economies are not that developed as, say, the economies of France and Germany and the Western European countries, it is a bit forced. I mean, normally, that we felt as well, normally by a normal evolution, our economies were far away from these standards. It needed to do that. Then, of course, the upside of it is that it will be compensated, or it was compensated by the money transfers from Brussels. So these are, I mean, leaving aside the current situation, the way that the Ukrainian administration functions under full-scale war is mind-blowingly commendable. Fantastic, absolutely fantastic. But when the negotiations will start, and these negotiations on the Ukrainian side will mean exactly adoption and implementation and reporting of that, of the EU, all the EU law, it will be very challenging.
Okay, thank you for the flattering words about our administration, how the state functions. I see we have now 4 questions. Wonderful.
Good evening. My name is Solomia Kucherenko. I'm a student of 4th year of Faculty of Law, and my question is more about the European Union. What do you think is the most, is the best way to reform EU in consideration with countries like Hungary? As we know, there are many problems with their policies, even from last news that we heard last week that even though they ratified the Rome Statute, they are not willing, for example, to arrest Vladimir Putin. Thank you.
We can take a couple of questions then, yes? So.
Thank you. My name is Yevgen. I'm a student of international relations, and my question is, there were some incentives in European Union, like to form a European army, a combined European army. And in the face of Russian invasion to Ukraine, will these incentives prosper? Will they come to the logical end? What do you think? Should European Union have its own army? Thank you.
So we're moving from reforming EU to the European Army. Now it's interesting about the next question. Colleagues, there were 2 more questions then. Oksana Troich, I think you had a question, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'm a professor of political science, dean of the social sciences, and my name is Alexander Demyanchuk. And also I taught for a long time such courses as the public policies of the European Union. And as I know, when we analyze public policies, we try to put everything onto monetarized expression. So the question might be quite difficult, I don't know, but if or when when Ukraine becomes the full member of the European Union, what will be the benefit for the European Union from this membership? What can be some incomes, some surplus for the European Union, not only budget, but there are many other aspects where the European Union may benefit from this membership. So could you please estimate what and to what extent the European Union will win taking Ukraine on board? Thank you.
And I think there was the last fourth question, if we can do one more. No? Somebody had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, good evening and thanks for your speech. My name is Kate, I study history. And my question is, what do you think about France and Germany? Because I know that in the EU we have a lot of supporters, but I'm particularly interested in these countries and their actions towards Ukraine. So how do you see their attitudes and positions in the future? And thank you.
Interesting. We have like 4 questions, moving from what you think about France and Germany, which is an interesting question. Then how would the European Union benefit from Ukraine's membership? I'm grateful to Professor Dimitruk for raising this question. There's a very interesting question about the European Union army, and then maybe relates to Macron's plan and France. So you have a hint as to answer that question. And of course, the reform about the European Union, a very good, from the legal point of view, question. And of course, we had the big elephant in the room, Orban, and his Hungary mentioned there in this question. So, Your Excellency, please.
Thank you. Very, very pertinent questions, each and every one of them. The EU has reformed itself already to address some of the issues that you hinted at. Over the last 10 years, more and more attention is being turned to the rule of law issues within the EU. Formerly, it was like the EU dealt with rule of law issues all around the world, especially in neighboring countries. Now the EU is discussing pretty thoroughly the rule of law issues within the EU. Some EU funds, some EU money has been linked with the full positive assessment by the European Commission and other member states with the rule of law situation, justice reform issues, very well known also here in Ukraine, in some member states. So this has already taken place and is taking place. The Eurozone crisis, 12 years ago, made the EU to reform as well. The EU never had to turn in much attention to the economic situation, the fiscal situation in the member states. Suddenly, it occurred that not all club members follow the common rules, so a system called economic governance was introduced, whereas all member states now have to submit their state budget drafts to the European Commission before they submit them to their own national parliaments. So the EU, I admit, within a club, it is always difficult. But the EU has been able and is able to reform itself also due to the changing situation. Since 24th of February last year, those intellectually interesting ideas of a European army have somehow died out. There is no serious talk of that. Has become again pretty clear that for the foreseeable future in Europe it is NATO and its transatlantic allies without whom security on the European continent is not possible. But that's as simple as that. And it's good to, as this former Finnish president once famously said, the beginning of all wisdom is all wisdom starts with acknowledging the facts, and it's a fact. A huge part of Ukraine, of Europe, would become stable and prosperous with Ukraine's accession. So that is the main benefit for the EU, as simple as that. For the same reason, it was so beneficial for existing member states, say Germany, that Poland acceded. Their big neighbor became stable, much more predictable, and much more prosperous. Even if it costs Germany an awful lot of money, the benefit is much, much bigger. You were asking in monetary terms. In foreign policy terms, that's what you most strive for in your international relations, and especially with neighbors. You want your neighbors to be as similar to you as possible, because similarity brings predictability. And having a big neighboring country becoming fully like us, fully predictable, stable, prosperous, there are all the benefits. France and Germany. Right. It is. I once saw I think it was published as well. I think the guidelines, sophisticated guidelines for a diplomatic service for a member state that acceded later, that was not among the 6 first ones. And it was like how to act in the EU, how to participate in discussions in Brussels and everything. And there was one piece of advice. Don't forget that in the end, the EU is a Franco-German affair. And it's really, it has to be said, it's where the EU started. The EU started with making sure that France and Germany, that had free wars during the previous 70 years, would never go to war again. France and Germany are the biggest member states, very wealthy, also having particular roles globally. France being the permanent member of the UN Security Council, Germany being an absolute world leader in trade. And it's still, to put it into terms of an actual practitioner of these things, an actual practitioner of diplomacy, it no longer is sufficient formally it may have been that France and Germany, Paris and Berlin agree on something and then the rest will follow. Then the decision is taken. Not that way anymore. But if France and Germany are not on board, both, it's very hard to see an EU decision coming into force or being taken. France and Germany do realize their historic role and responsibility. It has to be said. Sometimes, if you represent a smaller country in Brussels, sometimes you wish that they would agree on more issues, or they would agree or they would agree easier and quicker way than they do. But the sense of responsibility is strongly there. But issues like you may have read that currently one of the EU's flagship policies, which we all believe is sincerely necessary and right, the green transition. The agreement seemed to be already done on banning the internal combustion motors, engines. Suddenly Germany starts hesitating. France is passionately for the ban. Now Germany may not be fully. There are big issues where these two countries do not see eye to eye as well. So,
thank you. We still have some time for questions, like 15 minutes. Do we have anything from the audience? Yeah, there is a question.
Good afternoon. My name is Anastasia. I'm a political science student. Your Excellency, I have a question regarding the line of argument that is quite common from such states as Hungary in EU about the integration of Moldova and Georgia, and raising the question of their integration and giving them special circumstances and special mechanisms as it was provided for Ukraine. Do you think that there are such opportunities? There is this possibility of giving them special circumstances as well? And if so, do you think that this is dangerous for Ukraine's integration? And what are the reasons for example, Hungary raising this question and saying that if you want to integrate Ukraine, you have also to consider Moldova and Georgia? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question to collect with this round?
Good afternoon. My name is Tanya. I'm a political student too. And my question is more ideological than political, like real politics. And you mentioned in your speech a thing that I truly agree with, is that Eastern Europe and we, Ukrainian, we want to be integrated in the EU, like because it's our ideological thoughts. It's very essential for us to be with Europe, not with Russia. And most of Ukrainians think about EU like about this ideological opportunity not to be with Russia. And what do you think about these hopes, and will be Ukrainians or won't be Ukrainians frustrated when we will be with EU in the future, and then we will not find something like integrity or this European identity or something like this. So what do you think about these hopes, and will we be frustrated about it? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes, the third one there. Oh, fourth and third one, yeah.
My question will be concerning, as we already mentioned, the Marshall Plan, and there were a lot of talks about how we should use the money that EU and other countries will contribute to us. And my question will be, if you or any other experts you talking with somehow thinking about the supervisory board on using this money in Ukraine invested in, and how do you see it? And will the EU be in this board? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we proceed to the next question, Your Excellency, if the EU mission to Ukraine has any money for Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, we would gladly accept them with all the supervisory board. Yeah? So please, next question.
Mr. Maasікас, how worried are you about the various autocratic tendencies that were at times being observed throughout the Zelensky administration, and have sometimes the observers frequently remarked that there were lack of independence of different branches of government, and this was came up most recently during the passage of the new constitutional court law in December 2022. How big of a problem could this be down the road, and how hard will it be to unwind after this current crisis maybe subsides?
Thank you. We have just 10 minutes left, so Your Excellency, maybe you could briefly touch upon the questions.
With pleasure. First question was about the group of countries, Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. It is no secret that it was President Zelensky, it was Ukraine who opened that door. The door to the discussions, the real discussions within the EU, whether to grant the enlargement perspective. We all remember these dramatic circumstances where he signed the application to join on the 5th day of the war, and the EU rose to the challenge, rose to the occasion. Moldova and Georgia were the other two countries in the EU's Eastern Partnership policy that have, differently from, say, Armenia or Azerbaijan, that have clearly stated also their wish to join. And since this had already been started, it would have been very unwise to leave these two countries aside still. Why? Just because they didn't have a war. Having said this, the EU accession process is a merit-based process. And it's not like some countries will get shortcuts. And it is a firmly individual process. And I think it's very good that the EU was able to extend this perspective, because it is the will of these people, not even the governments, but these people. The people of Georgia, the people of Moldova support EU's membership almost as massively as the Ukrainians. So this was extending the hand to these people. Now I lost the second question.
I think the second one was ideological, if we are going to be disappointed once we join the European Union to see some sort of European identity. That was Tatiana's question. Are we going to be disappointed when we join the European Union where we expect some sort of,
Do I read your question right, that right now the wish to get away with everything Russian is so strong that it doesn't matter that much where to, just away. correct. In very many languages, Indo-European languages that I know, the word independence is defined via a negation. Independence, unabhängigkeit, незалежность. It's to be independent from somebody, from something. Belonging to a nation that had to fight free from the Russian Empire, I fully see this, and there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, us Estonians, it helped pretty much at the beginning of 1990s. Wanted to do everything 180 degrees the opposite way than we had been doing in the Soviet times. We knew exactly that we don't want anything to do with Russia, with the old ways, with the Soviet institutions. It didn't work out that badly for us, and will not work out badly for you either. To my mind, Ukrainians share the same values as Europeans: freedom, democracy, or freedoms, democracy, rule of law, respect to minorities. I would be surprised if you were that disappointed when you get to the EU. But first, let's get rid of everything Russian. That is something I understand, this feeling of Ukrainians very well. Now it was about the Marshall Plan, and the plan is not yet there. The war is unfortunately ongoing. And I think it's fair to say that nobody has an experience of such a massive reconstruction exercise that should bring hundreds of billions from different sources, where the Ukrainian participation, Ukrainian buy-in, if you will, must be ensured, and all that. What is being done is that already last July in Lugano at the Ukraine Reform Conference, the basic principles were adopted, including by Ukraine. Basic principles like transparency, like building back greener, inclusiveness, all those things, and a donor coordination platform, a forum for the donors to exchange information and coordinate with the Ukrainian participation has been agreed or established. It's not a fund, at least not yet, but a forum to exchange information and to coordinate is there. If you ask me at this stage, what would be, to my mind, the biggest challenges in reconstruction? Of course, first you need to win the war and then start this. First is how to eliminate all risks of corruption. It's damaging for the Ukrainian society's morale if corruption was there, and it's absolutely damaging for the Western partners' willingness to give money there. And second, not fully unlinked, is how to ensure fair distribution. that the assessment needs, that the needs assessments were there, high quality, that these sums would be distributed also regionally according to criteria, to objective needs, and not according to who gets along with whom, and all those issues. Here is a very clear link to the successful decentralization reform. It is only natural that in such extreme situations like war, things tend to get centralized again. Because of course, I mean, the headquarters of the army is very centralized. President Zelensky sits in the center and actually and leads this country. So it is a natural tendency. One must not abandon the decentralization, which to my mind, if I read the Ukrainian society, suits Ukrainians very well. Not to bow to the palaces somewhere in the central capital, but to actually to keep things in their own hands where the community lives, and community must manage itself. These, if you ask me, were the challenges. I have been dealing with the justice reform in Ukraine since the day of my arrival in September 2019. And of course, justice reform went on far before I arrived. It's never easy. None of the steps that has been taken was easy. All those new bodies, all those selection committees, all those painful discussions that who should have how many votes in the selection committee, how can we eliminate those who are not dobrochestность, who are not ethical there, and all those issues. Because not everybody in Ukraine wants an uncorrupt court system. That's clear. That's absolutely clear. The key here is, unfortunately, I must say, it is much easier to adopt these laws and even to set up these bodies like the reformed High Council of Justice. It is being reformed. More than half of members are new, selected with the international participation. These are still the easy parts. The most crucial thing that takes time is that people start to trust these institutions. And not only people in terms of citizens, voters, but also that the political leadership starts to trust these institutions. All state institutions, in fact. As you don't take your own state seriously if you don't actually trust or believe in your own institutions, in your own ability, and that's what we had been observing in Ukraine for the first decades of its independence. Now there's a much better chance. But your trust to your own state starts with that you start to take your own institutions seriously. And that's a huge challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I really enjoyed your inspiring and balanced presentation, even with some inspiring but also interesting things. And because we need to end up now, I'm not going to wrap up our discussion, but I would like to say that we welcome you for another visit if you have time and opportunity. Maybe not in Pidwall, but in our auditories. So I think we can give a nice chlop chlop.